The U.S. embargo against Cuba now in place for 60 years. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu. This is The Heat. Cubans have been living under a U.S. economic embargo for 60 years. It was imposed in February of 1962, and there is no indication that it will be lifted anytime soon. The blockade has been denounced by Cubans who say it has severely hurt the island nation's economy. But over the decades, the U.S. has persisted with the policy insisting that Havana must improve its record on human rights. We begin with this report from Havana by CGTN correspondent Luis Chirino.
Over the past 6 decades, many Cuban generations have been born and raised under the U.S. economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba by former U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Initially, it was a response to Fidel Castro's expropriation of U.S. property and the country's increasing links to the former Soviet Union. The original trade prohibitions imposed by JFK took an extraterritorial nature, impacting Cuba's trade with third countries, after President George H.W. Bush signed a law to strengthen the embargo in 1992.
The game changer was the Torricelli Bill. As soon as the U.S. government signed the Torricelli Bill, Canada, Mexico, the European Union were up in arms because the Torricelli Bill said to companies, to subsidiaries of American companies in these countries, that they could not do anything with Cuba. And that's against international law. That's exactly what extraterritoriality means.
And in 1996, after Cuba shot down 2 U.S. private planes flown by a Miami-based exile group previously warned about violating Cuban airspace, former U.S. President Bill Clinton signed legislation further targeting Cuba's trade relationships with third countries and restricting a president's ability to end the embargo without congressional approval. The United Nations General Assembly has overwhelmingly backed a Cuba-sponsored resolution demanding the end of the U.S. embargo for 29 years in a row. Washington has defended the embargo as a means to advance democracy, promote respect for human rights and freedom for the Cuban people, despite the ongoing international pressure to lift it. In 2014, the U.S. administration under Barack Obama favored a thaw bilateral relations and moved to normalize relations with Cuba. But trade and travel restrictions were reimposed later under former U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump also imposed new restrictions on trade and family remittances. The policies even impacting the island's capabilities to fight COVID-19. President Joe Biden campaigned on promises to reverse many of Trump's Cuba measures, but as of now has not done so. Cuban authorities say the U.S. embargo has impacted all sectors of Cuban society, costing the island more than $147 billion since 1962, while inflicting a human damage that's beyond measure. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
We have a great panel to discuss all of this, and joining me now from Havana is Carlos Alzugaray. He is a former Cuban diplomat and educator. With us here in Washington is Peter Kornbluh. He's a senior analyst with the National Security Archive. He's also director of its Cuba Documentation Project. Also joining us from Havana is Cristina Escobar. She's a Cuban journalist and political analyst. And joining the discussion, too, is Brian Becker. He is the executive director of the Act Now to Stop War and Racism Coalition. Welcome all of you to the broadcast. Carlos, let me begin with you. You've lived through this. It's known as the blockade in Cuba. Give us a sense of what it's meant for Cuba's economy and development over the past 6 decades.
You have to bear in mind that it's a number of regulations that practically impact anything that Cuba does internationally. It not only stops us from trading with the United States. Remember when these unilateral sanctions were imposed on Cuba, Cuba's main trade partner was the United States. So the impact was huge.
Cristina, let me ask you about the goal of the embargo, because it was set out by Assistant Secretary of State Lester Mallory. He wrote this in a memo in 1960, and that's since been declassified. The purpose is to cause desperation, lower wages, cut off supplies, cause hunger, so people will overthrow their government. The goals outline expressly cruel in nature. That, of course, before a pandemic. Talk to us about how COVID-19 has complicated it even more and inflicted more pain in a sense.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, in a circumstance like this of a pandemic, the common sense, the common decency would indicate that sanctions or unilateral coercive measures are weakened or suspended because there is a worldwide emergency because of the pandemic. It has been, as a matter of fact, the opposite. The U.S. Aggressive policy on Cuba has used the pandemic as an ally and has used it to make things even worse in Cuba. Not only in terms of the economic pressure that, as a matter of fact, is a reality, as Professor already said, but also because of everything related with the pandemic. Cuba tried to import ventilators from the U.S., impossible because of the sanctions. Cuba struggles to buy some components of the homemade vaccines with which we have vaccinated 80% of the population. It has been more expensive, and it has been harder in every possible way to produce the vaccines because of this, although we do have the scientific potential to do it, and indeed, as a matter of fact, we did it, but it was far more complicated and, of course, more expensive. Of course, if you are in a condition of like, for example, you and a lot of people in the U.S. used and were able to work because using Zoom and using apps and using technology that for Cubans is impossible to use because of the sanctions. We are used to using VPNs, and in the end, we Cubans find a way to do it, but definitely, instead of making things easier because of a pandemic, things have been even worse in terms of how aggressive and how precise the sanctions has been used to do what exactly Mallory said in 1960, to create such a pressure, such a problem, such a discontent from the people, and to blame the government on everything. Not that we don't have domestic problems, we do have many of them, but definitely the sanctions have a lot of responsibility for the situation that we are enduring today.
Peter, obviously the objective was regime change. We're 60 years into this experiment. It hasn't worked. You've done a lot of research into the back channels, efforts to try and reduce the tensions, create some kind of dialogue over the years. That hasn't worked either. Why?
I mean, the trade embargo started out as an effort to create conditions for overthrowing the Castro government, which U.S. officials understood was extremely popular in the months following and years following the revolution. So the issue for U.S. officials was, how do we delegitimize and curtail Fidel Castro's appeal and the appeal of the revolution to the Cuban masses, and creating deprivation and desperation was the original idea, coupled with, of course, covert operations run by the CIA to organize the Bay of Pigs invasion and undermine the Cuban government and the Cuban economy through covert measures. Obviously, that's failed. We just posted a 1982 CIA analytical study which stated point blank the embargo has failed to achieve its objectives, and that was done 20 years after the embargo started. Now, 40 years later, obviously, there's still no positive results for the original goals of the embargo. So the embargo has gone from being a tool of regime change to being a political cudgel by hardliners in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress, who simply want to, blast Cuba and appear to be hardline on Cuba and garner Cuban-American votes in Florida. And that is what has sustained it over these last 60 years. Nobody really benefits from the embargo. Not U.S. businesses, not U.S. national security interests, not humanitarian interests in supporting the Cuban people, not our goals to actually help Cuba evolve and the Cuban private sector evolve, which is President Biden's avowed goals. None of those are going to happen with this embargo, but since it serves a political purpose for a handful of Cuban-American legislators, it has stayed in place all these years.
Peter, we did see an opening in 2016. Then President Obama traveled to Havana. We heard from him and Raul Castro. Let's listen to his sound. I want to get your thoughts on the other side.
The embargo is the most important obstacle to our economic development and the well-being of the Cuban population. That's why its elimination will be essential for regular bilateral relations.
The embargo is going to end. When? I can't be entirely sure, but I believe it will end, and the path that we're on will continue beyond my administration.
Peter, talk to us about the path that he started and then what happened when Trump came in.
Well, I was sitting in the audience when Raul Castro and Barack Obama made those statements at a press conference in Havana. I was part of the White House press corps that traveled with President Obama for that historic trip in which he openly called for Congress to vote to lift the embargo. The embargo's expiration date had come and gone, President Obama said at the time. It's time to lift the embargo. But as Ambassador Carlos Alzugaray pointed out in your lead-in segment, unfortunately, the embargo has been codified into law. It started as a presidential decree under Kennedy, but in 1996, after the shoot-down of these exiled planes over Havana, over the ocean between Havana and Washington, in the United States, you had Senator Jesse Helms demand that the embargo laws be codified into the Helms-Burton bill. And now it's going to take a vote in Congress to lift the embargoes, these sanctions. There's a lot of sanctions that President Biden can simply unilaterally remove, but the actual structure of the embargo is going to take a vote in Congress. And the Democrats just don't have those votes. They don't have the political will and capacity to push that vote forward and fundamentally change the perpetual hostility in U.S. policy towards Cuba.
Brian, the international community is voting on this. They have been voting on this since, I think it's 92, this General Assembly resolution, which basically asks the United States to lift this embargo. This vote isn't even close, is it?
No, it's only the United States and Israel, I believe, at this point, who are voting to sustain the blockade of Cuba. The rest of the world is pretty united. Almost never has this degree of unity that this embargo or blockade, as the Cubans call it, should be lifted. You know, when you think about what the blockade is doing, Cuba is an island country. It's an island. And so, of course, it has to trade with other countries. It has to be able to import as well as export goods. And when you deny an entire people the ability to achieve or gain that which they need to sustain civilian life in modern society, it's a form of collective punishment against the whole people, because the United States government says, we don't like your government, so we're going to deprive you of food and medicine, or in summertime of electricity, so that you can have air conditioning. I mean, when we go over international law, especially the international law established at the end of World War II, where the crimes of Nazism were put on trial at Nuremberg, collective punishment was deemed to be a crime against humanity. And that's what the blockade is. It's a collective punishment against the Cuban people for having dared to have a revolution and to become independent of the United States. And now the United States says, we'll never stop trying to strangle you until you come back into our fold. In other words, the worst form of kind of colonialism or neocolonialism.
So, Brian, what does this do to the U.S. standing in the international community?
Well, it's a blemish, it's a scar, it's a stain. But the problem is the U.S. is like the 700-pound gorilla. It sits pretty much wherever it wants to sit. So the rest of the world can protest the embargo, protest the blockade, but the United States says to the rest of the world, if your ship dares to dock in Havana, in a port in Havana, we won't allow you entry to a U.S. port. So make your decision. Do you want to trade with an island country of 13 million or trade with the largest economy in the world? So it's a kind of blackmail against the rest of the world, in spite of the fact that the rest of the world is saying very clearly, very plainly, end this blockade.
Carlos, I want to get your thoughts to what Brian said, but I also want to ask you about, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who says there is no embargo on Cuba, but rather an embargo on the Cuban regime. What do you say to the people who make the argument that this isn't aimed at the Cuban people, it's aimed at the government?
Well, let me say it very clearly. It's cynical on his part. By the way, he recently said that, yes, there was an embargo or a blockade. I mean, these are unilateral coercive measures that the United States imposes on Cuba. And of course, there's no way that you can separate the economic sanctions. Yes, I'm going to do this with the government, but not this with the Cuban people. But on the other hand, you have to take into account that the Cuban government really takes care of the people. Any damage that you cause to the Cuban government damages the Cuban people. If you curtail the amount of oil that Cuba can import because you sanction even ships have been sanctioned by Donald Trump. you are practically making it very difficult for the Cuban government to maintain the supply of electricity, of gasoline, etc. So there's no way that this. Let me tell you something. Let me add to something that my predecessor said. You know, when these measures were discussed at the beginning, in the 1960s, there were two interesting reactions. The first was Christian Herter, at the time interim Secretary of State. When the first ideas about the embargo were talked about inside the Eisenhower administration, he said, but this is economic warfare. What you are proposing that we do is economic war on Cuba. And a little bit later, when the US was trying to make the UK support the blockade, Harold Macmillan, a conservative politician, said the same thing. This is economic warfare, and we are not going to contribute to it. This is what the world basically knows. This is economic warfare. Another important point, there is something that the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, which is the one that controls the measures, called secondary sanctions. What are secondary sanctions? Well, that's extraterritoriality. Basically, it is that any transaction that the Cuban government does with anywhere in the world in dollars has to be reported to OFAC, and in some cases even approved before the transaction takes place. This means that many banks have been fined for not complying with the reporting of these transactions. But this means that many banks have to have whole departments trying to explain all these minutiae of all these explanations to the Treasury Department of the United States. And frankly, I was told by a European banker, he said to me, Ambassador, this is too expensive. It makes any transaction with Cuba too expensive. So the result is that even, I'm going to put my example. I recently gave a course to students at the University of Zurich. When the University of Zurich wanted to pay me, no bank in Switzerland would handle a payment of $800. Come on, this is crazy. This is persecution, is perverse. One final point. It combines with the political aspect of U.S. policy towards Cuba. The U.S. doesn't only sanction Cuba economically, it promotes social unrest by financing political groups, political opposition that otherwise don't come out. The interesting thing is that they recognize it from the beginning. They recognize that it has been impossible to promote a political opposition to the Cuban government. So I would say finally that the U.S. is the one isolated by its policy towards Cuba.
Cristina, you're also there in Havana. I want to get your thoughts on what Rubio said. Again, he said there is no embargo on Cuba, but rather an embargo on the Cuban regime. Rubio is seen as the architect of the Trump policy. So also describe for us what happened when Trump shifted things in terms of cruise ships coming to Cuba.
Well, where I am now, Old Havana, used to be full of tourists from all over the world, but a lot of Americans that came, U.S. visitors that came in cruise ships. That's gone, and of course that has a particular effect, and that goes straight against what Rubio says. That goes against the domestic family business around Old Havana or around touristic poles like in Cienfuegos or Santiago de Cuba. These are families, small businesses that the U.S. visitors tend to go to that lost jobs and lost income from one day to the other because of measures imposed by Trump, advised by Rubio, saying that, as a matter of fact, it's against the government and not against the Cuban people. And it's even worse. It is against the Cuban people, but it's even worse. The most vulnerable people, like children, elderly, single mothers, black women and men, these are the people that are that has less incomes, that are more vulnerable, and of course are made more vulnerable because of the sanctions. This is something that just Oxfam said this year in an amazing report demonstrating that the sanctions are a main reason why human rights records in Cuba are not better, because if you are prevented from buying food in normal prices, if you are prevented from using dollars in an international economy that uses mainly dollars, if you're prevented from using technology for health purposes, if you're prevented from buying ventilators for COVID-19 treatments, then of course human rights records are affected because of the sanctions. And of course this has nothing to do with how the Cuban government deals with the human rights situation in Cuba, because the US has relations, perfect and very profitable relations with many countries in the world that have quite a questionable human rights record. This is a political purpose. In the moment in which Cuba became a political card in the US elections a lot of years ago, all of this became not a foreign policy issue but a domestic policy problem. And in the way, generations of Cubans are suffering that. And I do have many examples, from drivers that are no longer going around and made a good living out of what the US visitors paid, and many other issues related with cutting the cruise ship bans, from restaurants to small artists that sell their art. This is the Cuban people. This is not the government. This is not government-sponsored people. This is people that used to live, that had an independent income, and are now stripped from that because they suspended the cruise ships. Of course, the narrative of saying that this is against the government works for them, because then you lose all the idea that this is a humane, this is against common decency, and this is causing suffering to the Cuban people, an impoverished country, a third world country that is already under a huge amount of pressure because of the structural problems of this economy. And then you put the sanctions on top of that, and of course the people that are going to feel the burden more are not in the government, are in the people on the streets, are the common everyday Cubans. And that's why it's such cynical and so pervasive and damaging to listen to a voice like Marco Rubio that has made a political life out of talking about Cuba, although he has never been here before, and believes that Cuba is a prop in his political career.
Cristina, if the embargo were lifted, what kind of Cuba would you see there?
That's such a difficult question to answer. I can't imagine. But on the top of my head, I would guess that, first of all, the economy would be completely different. Commercing with the rest of the world, trading with the rest of the world normally. Cuba doesn't know how to behave like a normal country in the international scenario, because we're not. If you can't use dollars, if you can't buy anything on credit-based sales, like using credit, that's impossible. So it would be quite different from any other. Seeing American companies being part of the Cuban economy, seeing the American people knowing this country, and the Cuban people also getting to know in a fluid, transparent, legal and safe migration in both ways. That would be amazing. I don't see that happening. I don't see an expiration date on the sanctions, unfortunately. But the reality is that when you're going to evaluate how Cuba is as a country, how the Cuban Revolution, how this political system works or not, you can't, when you do that analysis, you can't leave out the burden of the sanctions that are perfectly, and it's the biggest and the most comprehensive system of sanctions any country in the world has ever suffered. So the question is how this country has survived. And for me, that I was born in the end of the in the end of the 80s, that have nothing to do with the 60s. That in my lifetime have nothing to do with the Cold War. However, my generation, my daughter, are suffering. We are suffering the effects of the sanctions. So I wish, if we're going for wishful thinking, it would be great to see common decency and care and true empathy for the Cuban people in lifting the sanctions. But unfortunately, I still think that the political interests are going to be far more important than what's important for the people of Cuba.
Peter, as I mentioned earlier, you've traced kind of the back channel negotiations that have gone on through the decades on this, and you tell a great story about Fidel Castro, I think, asking an American emissary, you know, what's it going to take? And then you get into this anecdote about porcupines. Can you tell that story?
Well, that story goes back to 1963, when an emissary from the Kennedy administration, James Donovan, was negotiating the release of prisoners from Castro's jails. First, he negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners and exit visas for their families, and then he returned to try and get CIA operatives who'd been arrested and a bunch of other Americans out of Cuban jails. And Castro was basically saying to Donovan, you know, we've negotiated these deals. maybe this could be a stepping stone to improved relations. And Donovan said, Mr. Premier, do you know how porcupines make love? And Castro responded, after consulting his translator, no, I don't. And Donovan said, well, very carefully. And that is how Cuba and the United States will find its way back to normal relations with careful negotiations. But here's the key point. We had those careful negotiations during the Obama administration, almost 2 years of secret talks led on the Cuban side by Raul Castro's son, Alejandro Castro Espin, and on the U.S. side by two top White House aides to President Obama. And they led to a breakthrough. And what's painful here is that President Biden, who was vice president at the time, and his top aides in this administration, Jake Sullivan and others, were all part of that team that knew that this was going on and saw the incredible results of the normalization of relations under the Obama administration, the loosening of the embargo as much as Obama could under his executive authority, the prosperity that started to come to Cuba, the growth of the private sector in Cuba, the collaboration between Cuban authorities and U.S. authorities on issues of mutual interest, such as migration, counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, all positive results that could be seen in a very short period of time. There is no doubt that when you look back on those 2 years, 2015, 2016, part of 2017, that you'll see the incredible impact for Cuba and for U.S. interests that has now been lost during the Trump administration and now with President Biden inheriting the Trump policy and sustaining it for political purpose.
Brian, just briefly, if you can, 30 seconds. This is an international issue, but it's so domestic. We've talked about Marco Rubio. All of these politicians who run for president, they see Florida as a key state. That's one of the key problems here, right?
It's a key problem, although, you know, I think the fact that Joe Biden maintained 243 coercive measures imposed by Trump isn't only about Florida. I think Obama recognized that the U.S. was becoming isolated in Latin America as the continent was moving to the left. Biden now senses, and the U.S. government senses, that momentum has receded, and now they're going still for regime change in Cuba. So I think it's domestic politics, but I still think it's a foreign policy based on regime change.
I can't thank you enough. A great discussion. Really appreciate it. And that is going to do it for us. Thanks so much for joining us on this edition of The Heat.